Hey guys, first thing I wanted to look at is the kick and bass. I want to look at these together because they are intrinsically linked in the way that a lot of dance electronic music is these days. And I don't think synthwave is any different, so let's get straight in. Okay, first things first, let's just have a listen to what these things sound like by themselves. Just going to check I haven't got any mastering on because I'm running from the project that I used, the project file that I used. So let's just have a listen to this. So if you've watched the Synthwave Tech Tips already, you'll know a little bit about kick drums that were used, and you'll know about bassline sounds, bassline patterns, and you'll probably recognize the bassline at least. But what I've done is I could have used a sample. So let's come into Sonic Academy's Synthwave sample pack. But what I've actually done is for the kick drum, I've used Kick 2. And I've used a modified preset. The preset's called Sweet, and it was in the pop section. So in fact, let me just show you that kick first. Sweet. Right, so this is what I used to start with. Actually, this might be quite loud. Let me just turn it down. Yeah, so this is a very modern sounding kick. And if we actually look at synthwave kicks, it actually sounds a lot like that one, the Sweet preset. But these two in particular, this is the Lindrum and TR-505 style kick. But rather than go down that route, because when I received the vocals, I decided that this was going to be quite a fast, a slightly more modern take on synthwave with echoes of the Midnight Sound. So we're using these two as a kind of reference, but obviously this Sweet preset is way more modern and punchy than that. And what I've actually done is I've turned it into this. So really it's just a case of messing with the click. So if we look at the, I don't know if I can get these both up at the same time. Yeah, so the click on the original preset, which is here, the Sweet preset, is pitched all the way down and it's very, very loud. And what I've done is I've pitched it back up again. This is where it was, and this is where I've taken it. And I've just taken the level right down. So we're at minus 20 dB, something like that. And that's where it was in the original preset. But you just don't need that level of click in these synthwave kicks. And if we look at the amp envelope on the original kick, so we're running at 478 milliseconds, and the pitch envelope is quite tight here. And I've loosened the pitch envelope off a little bit. It's still at 478, but I've rounded this amp envelope off on the adjusted kick. So it's giving us a kick that's a little bit more like the ones that were used in the 80s. We don't have to be a slave to that 80s sound. But you don't want a modern, thick, punchy, super punchy kick in this kind of track, I don't think. So that's what I've done with the kick. In terms of pattern, 1, 2, let's run it with the click track. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's running on eighth notes. Sorry, it's running on half notes. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're getting 2 beats, 2 kicks per bar. And what you would traditionally run with on electronic music is move down. You get those quarter notes, but we're not doing that. We're running the kick at half the speed, and that's playing off against the snare. And then in this last section here, bap, bap. So we've got a little 16th note frill at the end there to give it some interest. And that happens every 2 bars. So running against the bass line, So generally speaking, as we've looked at in the Synthwave Tech Tips, you can run 8th notes rolling bass line or 16th notes rolling bass line. For this track, I felt that 8th notes was working better. Now, you don't have to do these rolling bass lines, but they're so popular and so common. And I felt that with the feel of this track, it kind of worked. This 8th note rolling bass line worked with this. Now, this track at the top here called SC, that's my sidechain track. Usually I would use LFO tool, but what I've tried to do is, as I've probably already mentioned, is keep this Ableton native as much as possible so that you guys can download the project and just follow along. So what I see, you'll see. I don't have to render out parts. You don't have to kind of use audio. You can just look at exactly what I've done. So the sidechain channel here is just a simple instance of, where are we? Kick 2. And I've just got a very, very short kick running here. A very short clicky kick to use as my trigger. So that's almost irrelevant. We don't need to look at that channel anymore. But in terms of processing on the kick, I'm going to go through the processing channel by channel because I don't do a lot of processing. You've probably noticed that already, guys. I'm not really into complicated processing. It hurts my head. So I tend not to do it. So all I've got on the kick channel itself is a little bit of EQ. I'm taking out the very, very low end, below 30 hertz. And I've got a bit of a dip at 330. And that's at the very top end of what you might call boxy. That range between 100 and 300 is where you get that really kind of, it's a frequency range that can really mess up with a mix and make a mix sound really muddy. In fact, I'd say 330 is probably more muddy than boxy. Boxy's slightly lower. But let's have a listen to that in isolation. Let's just solo the kick. No, it's probably still boxy there. But as I turn that EQ on and off, you can actually hear the kick it cleans itself up a little bit. And then I've got utility on there simply for gain control. Again, I do all my mixing as I go, and I use utility to set the level so that if I want to automate volume later on, I can do that with the channel faders, and I've got more resolution because they're all set to 0 dB. That's why I do that. I tend not to do a lot of volume automation, and I've probably even got into the habit of using utility as the volume automation source anyway, because you can still gain stage effectively with compression makeup gain, which is probably a bad habit, but sometimes I do it. Now the bass line, we have got some processing on this kick and bass bus as well, but we'll look at that in a second. The bass line, I'm running the Evergreen Poly 6 bass. No, not that one. And again, the reason I used it is just because it happened to work. Poly 6 bass is probably used, this is one of the presets I did for the Synthwave pack, is probably used in 10% of all Synthwave tracks. Back in the day when Synthwave first started becoming a thing, maybe a decade ago, probably maybe even half the Synthwave tracks ever made used this kind of sound. Originally from the Korg Poly 6 synth / plugin, but we can recreate it in other plugins as well, which is what I've done here. And again, everything I've used is either Kick 2, Anna 2, Ableton Native, or there's one free plugin I've used, which we'll have a look at in a minute, which is Tal Chorus. That's the only third-party plugin I've used, but it is free, so you guys can download that as well. I think I've only used it once or twice, though. So in terms of kick processing, let's just group all of this together. So again, it's just tightening up the sound a little bit. So in terms of EQ, I've rolled off at 44 hertz. Don't need to take a huge amount off. I've notched out a little bit 107. If you have a listen to this, this is very boxy. It's like that woofy sound. And if you don't get rid of these sounds, especially in bass and kicks, that frequency range can really add up and start sounding like, I use the word woofy a lot, that kind of sound in the background, and it'll build up subtly, and you won't know where it's coming from. So keep an eye on it per channel. Auto filter is just there for transition effects. It's not doing anything in terms of processing for the sound of the bass. The compressor is only being used for sidechain, and the source is, as I mentioned, from this sidechain channel, which is running 4 on the floor. It's not following the kick pattern, but I wanted that one, that ducking sound. And then finally, we've got utility, which I'm using for level, but I'm also using for this bass mono. This is quite important. So anything under 120 hertz is being pushed straight into mono, because this is quite a wide bass sound and it can start to sound very messy in the mix if you don't do this. So have a listen to it. I'm not getting a massive effect on these speakers because I've got them quite low, but on headphones it makes a big difference, and it also makes a difference in the mix, which we'll probably try and look at later on. So that's actually quite high. 120 hertz is quite high. Usually I might go around 80 to 100, but in this instance I felt that 120 was the right frequency to go for when I listen to everything together. And again, I do most of my mixing as I go. There's very little I will do after the effect. Sometimes I'll listen to a track the next day and things will need tweaking, but generally speaking I do all of this as I go. We will have a look at overall mixing again later on, but most of it will already be done. So the last thing to look at is the bus processing. Now again, I've got an EQ on this. I'm taking out anything below 40 hertz because we don't need it. And I'm also notching out 141. So again, listening to this in solo. Slightly above the woofy section. And then I've just got a little bit of glue compression. It's not doing a lot. If you have a look, it's really just catching the peaks of the kick. But it does help glue the sounds together. Let me switch it on and off and you'll see what I mean. So it's quite loose like that, but when I switch it on, just feel everything kind of, it's like audio liposuction. You'll also notice, if you're listening, the bass is moving around a bit, and this is because the original Poly 6 bass, one of the magical things about that particular bass sound is that the kind of oscillator phasing, which a lot of the time in electronic music you don't want. You don't want the bass sound phasing around because you want it static. Psytrance, again, is that perfect example of a bass line that is on perfect phase all the time, every note exactly the same. But synthwave is a bit looser, it's a bit more freeform, so I'm quite happy to leave that kind of moving bass sound as is. Right, that's pretty much it for the kick and bass, the fundamental foundation of the track. There's not a lot going on. You may think, hang on a minute, that still sounds a bit loose, but I do have a lot of mastering, which is all switched off at the moment. And I always have that in mind when I'm making these kinds of tracks, because I kind of know where I'm going to go with the mastering later on. So a lot of this will be tied up with mastering, which is apparently not what you're supposed to do, but who cares? That's what I do. Next video, we're going to look at percussion. There's not a lot of percussion in this track. You'll be surprised at how little there is. We'll bring in the hats and the snare. So I'll see you there.